Tonight, I will be telling 4 stories, from a story involving hiccups and their potential cause, a creepy statue with a hard-hitting storyline, a person experiencing sleep paralysis that may involve something a bit more sinister, and a swimming pool that is a portal to the other side. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors for making this video possible. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is of course as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Hiccups are a normal thing, right? We don't really know why we have them, and most of us don't really care. Well, yeah, they can be annoying, sure, but you normally just have to hold your breath and it goes away without any more trouble. No one really knows the reason why we got them. Some speculate that it's because we forget to breathe correctly, or when we choke on something. Last night, I found out the real reason. God, I wish I hadn't. It's not all as innocent as you think. I've always been getting hiccups, much more frequent than the average person. Actually, as far as I can remember, hiccups were something that always came when I would go to bed or was alone. I, of course, didn't think much of it. Now that people would tell me it was a normal thing and everyone had them, so I myself started believing that nothing was suspicious about it, until last night. I was at a dinner party with some friends I had known for a very long time, so, of course, they all knew of my too frequent hiccups, which meant that when my strange condition came creeping, they would all look at me and laugh. I myself made a joke of it too. My best friend, whom I, for the sake of privacy, will call Jake, asked me the very frequently asked question, why do your hiccups occur so much more often than anyone else? I raised my shoulder as to say, I know as much as you, which was the only answer I could give to that question. But this time, the hiccups were much more violent than they had ever been. To not raise unwanted attention to myself, I excused myself to the bathroom. I stumbled into the bathroom, using the sink to support myself as I had trouble standing up. The hiccups were beginning to turn violent, as it felt like my body was being torn apart from the middle. It felt like I had to throw up, but not the food I had just eaten. Something came up in that second. I saw my body falling to the ground. The sensation of watching yourself like you're another person is something almost no one experiences. While I was watching my body, I heard a roaring growl from behind me, a sound only a predator makes. I slowly turned around, seeing a creature, more horrifying than anything I had ever seen. The eyes resembled the eyes of a spider, but that was not the first thing that caught my eyes, because just below the creature's 4 eyes was a round mouth, at least as big as my head, with more teeth than I could count. As to its body, it did not resemble anything of this world, but the only thing I can compare it to is a black worm. As I took in the horrible sight of the creature towering before me, I realized that it was beginning to open its mouth, probably to eat me in one bite, which I had no doubt it could do with ease. My heart, or at least what felt like my heart, now that my organs were still in my body, was racing as I tried to think of a way to escape. The only thing I could do was abandon my body and run as fast as I could. So I ran for the door, moving my hand to turn the doorknob, only to realize my hand going right through it. My body got past the door as if it was normal air, but I had no time to stop in amazement. Now the creature was still chasing me. I ran into the living room with the creature still chasing right behind me. I saw all my friends sitting around the table, laughing, having fun. They did not notice me at all, or the horrifying creature, but now that I think about it, I do not think they could see me at all. One positive thing about being in the weird otherworldly plane was that I did not possess any materialistic body. I couldn't run out of breath. I must have run for a good while when I realized that fact. I had escaped the creature that was chasing me, but that was not the only one. This reality must have been the one all these creatures resided in, and I did not belong. Everywhere, I could see those creatures sucking some weird kind of dust from people. Kind of like the monsters from Harry Potter. And the strange thing I noticed was that all the people that were victims of the creatures all had hiccups. None of them suffered the same fate as me though. Everyone looked fairly unharmed afterward. I was hiding behind a tree in a park when one of the creatures jumped me. Before I had time to react, it started vacuuming the dust from my body, and I could feel my energy disappearing. It sucked all the life force out of me, and I did not doubt what would happen to me once it was finished. But suddenly, I felt a quick thump, and I felt the comfort of solid material again. I lay in a hospital bed with my friends surrounding it. They all had worried looks on their faces, while I was looking around the room very confused. A doctor came in shortly after, with a very kind look on his face. He told me that I had passed out, and my friend had called an ambulance, and that right before I woke up, I had started having trouble breathing. He couldn't explain why I passed out like that, so he was relieved when I had woken up. Of course, I knew the reason why, but he wouldn't believe me even if I told him. My hiccups haven't stopped since then. Apparently, I attract them way more than anyone else. Every time the hiccups come creeping back, I'm terrified. It's just a matter of time before one of them gets enough of a grasp on me to drag me into that weird space again. And when that happens, I might not be as lucky as the last time. So promise me, next time you get the hiccups, drink water, hold your breath, do whatever works. Because hiccups are not as innocent as you are led to believe. Everybody is scared of something. Bees, snakes, heights, holes, you name it. There's a phobia for almost everything. For example, the phobia of books is called bibliophobia. The fear of cows is bovinophobia, and the fear of the unknown is called xenophobia. Ever since I finished my education, I prided myself on being a very practical person, always wanting evidence to back up my facts, valuing knowledge, and shunning ignorance. So why, you ask, am I here? Writing on a website full of stories that have no evidence to back up how real they are. I have debated writing this for a very long time. Ever since I posted my husband's story onto this website, I have turned over the possibility of sharing my own experiences over and over in my head. Honestly, I'm not sure why I finally decided to do it now. Maybe it's because I'm becoming desperate. Many people wouldn't believe my story if I told it to them, no matter how much fear is in my eyes as I tell it. You have to have a certain kind of faith to believe these things. Faith that can only come from having experienced the unknown. I won't call my experiences paranormal. Yes, perhaps that is an acceptable term for them, but if you take a look at the word, you will notice that it means abnormal. Once again, maybe they are. But I don't view it that way. These experiences are only seen as abnormal because they do not happen very often. That doesn't mean that happenstances like this should be viewed as something strange. Everybody I know has had at least one experience in their life that would fall into this category. So, can we really say that it is not normal? Can we deny that there are things out there that we can't explain? Myths and legends all had to come from somewhere, and perhaps it isn't always the most credible source. But we can at least agree that some of these things are true. I can attest to the fact that, although I used to see most paranormal activity as a hoax, I'm not so sure anymore. The more I review my life so far, the more I realize that I am one of those people who has experienced the unknown. I blocked out my experiences for so long that I almost began to believe they didn't happen. Now, I know that it's not true. Although my parents are long dead, my mother's own diary attests to the experiences I had. I would not be writing this if I had not discovered the file on my husband's computer containing the truths of his childhood. I might still have brushed it off. If I had not seen him spiral into paranoia near the end of his time with us, I have no doubt of what happened to him. Yet, it is not something the police will accept. I fear for my own life because of this, and the life of the remaining family member, whom I so dearly care for. I suppose I should stop rambling. I have a purpose here, to tell you about my own experiences with the unknown, and I might as well get on to it. After today, I will no longer be able to write. This is a one-time thing. This computer is going to my dearest child. I just hope they can understand why I did what I did. That one day, they will know that I only did it for them. For now, I shall just write. Some of the earliest memories I have are of living in my parents' big brown house, with its seemingly endless rooms and secret passageways that led me to nooks and crannies under the stairs and behind the walls. Now I know that it wasn't quite so big or magical, but for a child with eyes full of wonder, it was the perfect place to live out my wildest fantasies. One of my favorite places to play was out in the back of the house, in the huge, hedged garden maze. The tall, Green walls were decorated with pink flowers in the spring, and in the summer, red berries would sprout from the stems extending out from the walls. I knew the maze like the back of my hand. Just like the house, it was filled with secret places and hidden passageways. As my parents were gone for most of my younger years, I would spend my time there. Eventually, I found my way to the middle of the maze, a place that even my parents thought was completely sealed off. In it, in the shade of a weeping willow tree, sat an old statue of a woman, kneeling on the ground with her mouth open in what looked to be a cry of pain. The statue was crumbling and mossy, but there was a small plaque at the bottom of it that named the statue, the Weeping Woman. I was enchanted by the tiny place. With its strange statue, I spent most of my afternoons there, sitting under that willow tree, a book in hand, or just aimlessly doodling, thinking. I would bring flowers to the statue in the spring, berries in the summer, and colorful leaves in the fall. I would make us daisy crowns and declare the maze my kingdom, with her my faithful servant. Sometimes I would be lulled to sleep, only to wake hours later, roused by the parents' call for dinner. My favorite time there, however, was during the winter. The soft snow would cover the statue and the skeletal limbs of the willow, making them look ghostly and ancient. I loved making things out of snow that my parents would not be able to tell me to knock down. They were meticulous about how their home looked, and snowmen on the front lawn were definitely not acceptable. Every time I crafted another snow creation, I would smile wider and wider, sometimes even playfully whispering, "Freedom." It was my safe place. There was something strange about it though. The gardener had always cautioned me against visiting the maze in the dark, although he would never tell me why. Of course, being the adventurous and bored child I was, it became my mission to infiltrate the maze and find my way to the Weeping Maiden. Countless times I tried to sneak away into the maze when the stars were high above my head, and every time I would be caught by the old gardener. Only one such attempt got me into the maze. I remember the night being clear and sharp, smelling very slightly like the aftermath of a rainstorm. At first, I only heard the soft night sounds and the quiet rustling of the hedge branches brushing against each other in the soft breeze. But then, far away, I could swear I heard something. It didn't quite fit the maze, though I wasn't sure why, and I found it indescribably and utterly wrong. I knew it did not belong here, although I had no clue what it was. I made up my mind to find the source of the sound, but the gardener caught me before I could get much further. As he dragged me from the maze, I asked him in breathless whispers about the sound. He did not answer me, but his expression changed, sad but also full of fear. He told my parents, and I was grounded for a week. It annoyed me at first, but eventually I stopped trying to visit the maze under the sheath of night. I limited myself to those lazy daylight visits, where I could lean up against the willow tree and let my gaze fall over the soft green grass and the moss that permeated the cracks in the statue's back. But in the back of my mind, I always did wonder, what had I heard that night? It was so very wrong, and yet, at the same time, I was drawn to it. I remember the summer that everything changed. I had always been homeschooled by my favorite maid, but that summer, my father's investments fell flat. I don't know all the details, but I do know that we lost a lot of money. We were barely able to feed ourselves, much less keep the house, so we got rid of all extra expenses. This included the gardener, the chefs, the maids. I was put into public school for the first time in my life. Before that, I lived my life without friends. There were a few people I knew outside of my home, but none of them were my age. I was starved of social interaction, used to doing things my way. When I got to school, it was a very hard time for me. I didn't understand how or why I was supposed to behave in a certain way, or why others did not bend to my whims as they usually did. People were, and still can be, a mystery I could not unravel. It took a year or so to fully adjust. By that time, I still had very few friends. I knew that most of them only got close to me because they had heard the rumors that my family was rich, so I was very wary of all potential friends. There was only one person my age that I really connected to. He was my first crush, as well as my very best friend. His name was Thomas, though he insisted I call him Tom. I have always used my full name, but he got me into the habit of using the nickname Cat, something I still use today. He and I got along splendidly, helping each other with math and science, and alleviating each other's boredom as the school days dragged on. We knew everything about each other, including our birthdays, middle names, favorite colors, and even foods. We talked about everything and nothing at all. Sometimes I missed those light-hearted conversations. My favorite thing to do with him, however, was whistle. At first, I could never get the hang of it, but he was patient. Eventually, I was able to whistle tunes with him. My very favorite tune to whistle was one that he used whenever he noticed I was distressed. It started off soft, and gradually got lighter and louder. We would dance to it together, and take turns whistling the tune together. He knew just how to make me feel better, no matter the cause of my woes. I can truthfully say that if the incident hadn't occurred, I would have married that boy. But alas, the incident did, in fact, occur. How I have blocked it out for so long is strange to me. The more I write, the more I remember, and now I can't stop my fingers from moving. It was a bright Friday afternoon. I was 15, and Tom and I were making our way back to my house. We had been planning a sleepover of sorts for my birthday for years, and now my parents finally agreed to let me have it. I couldn't wait to show them all the secret nooks and crannies of my house, and most importantly, the great maze, which I had so many fond childhood memories of. We made it to the house near 5. I enjoyed walking back to my house, even if it took quite a bit of time and exertion to do so. Tom was immediately astounded at the size of my house, exclaiming praise and excitement as we walked through the front gate, marveling at how the gate closed automatically behind us, and how long the rocky driveway to my house was. His joy was infectious, and soon I was grinning so hard that my jaw hurt. My mother greeted us when we got to the door. She brought us snacks and introduced herself to Tom, although I sensed that she disliked him. He did give off a playful sort of vibe, and my mother was harsh and strict, very practical, but she was courteous, welcoming him regardless of her thoughts on him. I remember that. I was glad of that. We spent the rest of the day dancing up and down through the house, exploring the secret passageways, and exchanging idle conversation. I waited until right before dinner to show him my favorite place. Finally, right before the sky began to darken, I took him into the maze. At first, I showed him the secret passages and secret places, but eventually, I consented to show him my safe place. He was very interested in it, and said that he would like to come back someday and just sit here with me, relaxing. I was overjoyed that he found the place as interesting as I did. Once again, I was sure that nothing could ruin my perfect day. I vividly remember watching him lean against the willow, legs crossed, and a comfortable smile on his face, with his wild hair and pretty green eyes. He looked like he belonged there, like he fit so perfectly that it would be a crime to take him away. I wondered if he would want to spend more time there. I wouldn't mind just watching him lay against the trunk of the tree. If only I had known. I suppose, now that I think about it, that I did get my wish. He really did look perfect sitting there. Now, I can stare all I want. We got back to the house right before dark, where he met my father, and we had dinner. Then, we holed up in the living room to sleep. My parents didn't trust me to stay in my room with a boy all night long. I'm not sure if they were right in this case, however. Maybe if I had something else to distract myself, I would not have made such a fatal mistake. The sky completely darkened. We sat in my living room, swapping scary stories, trying to startle each other, under the light of a small lantern. None of our stories turned out to be very scary, however. The account of the fact that we kept giggling every few seconds. I was running out of stories to tell. When I remembered the one from when I was young, I made my tone serious. "Tom?" I told my laughing comrade. "I've got one, and I swear to you, it's completely true." At first he laughed it off, but I was finally able to quiet him down to start my tale. "I was 7, I began. "You know the maze that I showed you? Well, we used to have a gardener who worked here. He told me to never enter it after dark, but never told me why." "Let me guess," he interrupted. "He died mysteriously in the maze." "No," I snapped back. Nobody dies in this story. It happened to me. He fell silent again, and I continued my narrative. I was always very bored, being the fact that I was always alone and had explored the entire estate from top to bottom. So, I took that as a challenge. I tried several times to sneak into the maze at night, but they never worked. But once, I snuck into there. The farthest I've ever gotten, and heard this sound. I can't quite explain it, but I knew it was very wrong, but also very, very mesmerizing. I wanted to find the source of it, you know? Tom was listening very closely now, not laughing even a little bit. "Did you find it?" he asked. I shook my head. Before I could, the gardener caught me. I tried a few times after that, but never found the sound. I've never heard it in the daytime, so I think it only happens at night, but I've always wondered. We were silent for a little bit. He was thinking hard, contemplating something, and I was waiting anxiously for his reaction. "This happened? Really? Truly?" he finally asked. "Really, truly," I affirmed. He was quiet for a little longer, before speaking again. "This gardener, does he still work here?" I shook my head no. A familiar grin began to spread over my friend's face. I had seen the grin before, anytime he wanted to do something mischievous. He looked up at me with a playful light in his eyes. "I have an idea," he said. "Instead of sitting in this house all night, swapping stories, we could maybe go check out the maze and find whatever was making that sound." I should have said no. My gut was telling me to say no. I should have said no, but he was looking at me with a sweet, playful look in his eyes, and I melted just a little bit. I would have done anything for that boy. Anything and everything. This was no exception. It was, however, an exceptional mistake. "All right," I allowed, a bit nervous. "Let's go." We hurried softly and quietly out of the house as to not wake my parents from their deep slumber. The maze was tall and black from where we stood on the porch steps. It looked threatening and dark in ways it never had before. Perhaps it was because of the swirling mist that coated the ground, or the fact that the moon was barely a sliver. Maybe it was just my internal compass, screaming at me that this wasn't right, that nobody could save me now, that the gardener was gone, that something horrible was about to happen. "You ready?" Tom asked in a tone of voice that gave me butterflies. "Yes," I said in a sharp voice. No, I was not. The night was thick with condensation as we set off into the maze. Sounds were muted, objects foggy and unclear. I knew my way through the maze better than anyone, so I kept assuring myself that I would be fine. Tom would protect me. I would be fine. As soon as we stepped into the maze, I felt a chill slide down my back, like a final warning. I shook myself, steeling my nerves, and then slumped, suddenly, as if my own body were giving up on stopping me. My fate was out of my own control, though I didn't realize it then. We started into the maze. After a few steps, we both stopped, listening. There it was, the sound from before, faint and ragged, yet strangely clear compared to all the other sounds I heard. I still wasn't sure what it was. My head ached from trying to decipher it. Tom whispered to me, "Is that it?" I nodded again. For a moment, I was sure I saw a flash of fear in his eyes, but then his gaze hardened. "Let's find that sound." We continued into the maze, our ears tuned to the sound. It was strange, because it was so very mesmerizing, even though it was so wrong. It made my heart hammer in my chest from fear, but also from a strange excitement that I had never felt before. It might have been dread, but there was too much adrenaline in my system for me to notice. I found that I did not need to control my body. My legs just knew where to go. I knew where we were heading to. I had walked this path so many times. We were going to the Weeping Woman. My eyes began to glaze over as we got closer. The sound got louder and louder, and the further I let myself fall, the more I could understand it. Something in the back of my mind, something buzzed again and again, trying to get my attention, but I ignored it. I found that I could begin to understand what I was hearing. It sounded like a dog of some sort, whimpering and moaning, animalistic yet full of something. Pain, perhaps. Seconds before we entered my hidden grove, one of my hands shot out, completely out of my will, and grabbed Tom. He froze, and we both blinked, realizing we had fallen into a trance. The sound was very loud now, coming from right around the corner. It thrummed through my bones, making me feel weak and sleepy. I could see the top of the willow tree. I think that was the last time my mind tried to stop me from going through with the facts. A last warning, holding on to the small vestiges of hope that flittered at the edge of my mind. We just looked at each other, silently communicating. His eyes were beginning to gloss over again, but he gave me that playful look, the one I couldn't fight, begging for me to keep going. We're so close. His pale green eyes seemed to promise. Come on, what could possibly go wrong? I gave in, stupidly, horribly. I gave in and everything went wrong. I think that I blocked this part out for so long that I had almost forgotten about it. Forgotten the horror and fear, paralyzing fear, that filled me. If not, my dreams have become nightmares, and I would have been haunted for the rest of my days. Now, I let myself remember. It doesn't matter anyway. We rounded the corner and I screamed, freezing where I stood. I had spent so much time in that little grove that, when it came down to it, I knew exactly where everything was placed. Exactly how it should have been. The weeping woman, on her knees, facing away from the willow tree that she sat directly in front of. We had left flowers for her that day. Daffodils and tulips. Red and white and yellow. They should have been right in front of her. Instead, she was turned, facing the tree, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed and moaned and growled, her pain visceral and subhuman. She was no longer cracked stone, though her skin was bone white, stretched against her lanky frame, standing out in the starless night. Her hair was dark brown, hanging raggedly from her scalp. Her clothes hung from her emaciated frame, only rags. Her limbs were too long to be human, as if she had been human once, but she had been changed. Around her seemed to float an aura of sadness. She smelled like rotting flesh. I only remember that because I heard Tom gag. My scream alerted her, although she did not act in the way I would have thought she would. Instead, she went perfectly still, inhumanly so. She turned her head around, not like a person, but in an owl-like fashion. Slow, horrible. Her hands were clutching the flowers we had left for her, long fingers curving into claws, but none of that compared to her face. God, that face. That image is stamped into my mind, never to be forgotten. Her eyes were wide, much too wide. I can't really call them eyes though. They were more like empty sockets, dark and deep, like looking down the insides of a well. They seemed to swallow up in stray light, emanating darkness. Tear tracks stole their way down her cheeks, but the tears were much too slow and much too thick. They were crimson to fresh blood. She was crying blood. Her mouth was closed, but as she saw us, it slowly tipped into a large, horrible smile. She did not have many teeth, but the ones she did have were yellow and brown, and sharp as the curve of her clawed fingertips. Her mouth was stained red, covered in blood and gore, some from the tears of blood that slipped down her pale face, and some from other things. Then she was moving, faster than I ever could have imagined somebody on all fours could have moved. I was paralyzed with the most fear I've ever felt. It was like the moment slowed, just enough, that my chilled blood no longer pumped in my veins. For a few terrible seconds, I thought I would die of fright, but at the last second, right before those horrible clutching fingers closed down on my wrists, I felt my instincts kick in. My hand clasped over Tom's, and I turned, booking it from the little garden. I know that if I had not had such an understanding of the many passages of the maze, I would have shared the same fate as my poor, beloved Tom. I sometimes wonder if I could have saved him, if I had held on tighter. Perhaps I could have pulled him from the maze. We could have made it to the house and cuddled in the living room, making a pact to never tell anyone about our experience ever again. It should have been that way. We should have been happy. but the universe is full of horrible secrets and unknown facts, and our sudden knowledge of this seemed to whet its rage. I tried to run, but Tom was still paralyzed, slowing me down as he tripped and stumbled behind me in a kind of daze. The weeping woman leapt out from the little place that I had spent so many lazy days in, teeth bared in a silent scream. She looked excited, eyes blazing, as much as eyes that dark could blaze, with a wild, crazy, reckless emotion. Excitement, but more feral. She had stopped crying, but blood still tracked slow, red lines down her gaunt face. She followed us on all fours, her limbs strangely extended for that very purpose. I knew that she would catch us. Tom was slowing me down too much. I had to make a split-second decision. It is something I will always regret, even though I know that, if not for my response, I would have perished in that garden maze. I let go of Tom's hand, looking over my shoulder as I ran, image blurred by tears. He stood still, frozen, green eyes wide with that horrible shocked expression. Just as I turned the corner, I saw the woman, or creature, leap through the air. Excited eyes focused on my defenseless best friend. I was lucky enough to not see what happened, but I did hear a sickening thud and the sound of something ripping, teeth gnashing. As I continued running, the last thing I heard was Tom's terrified, blood-curdling scream. The horrible, bleak silence that it left in the air filled me, choking me. It pierced my bones, chilling me to my very core. My limbs felt heavy, numb. Yet, through the muggy night, I continued to run, relying on my legs to carry me through muscle memory, letting my eyes fill with tears. Finally, I made it out of the maze, my breathless sobs and moans sounding a bit like the woman's had, but still more human-like. I burst through the doors of my home, wailing at the top of my lungs. My parents, immediately woken by my screams, were summoned to my side, asking me question after question. I didn't hear or respond to any of them. They must have noticed Tom's absence, but weren't quite sure what had happened. They called his parents, at first thinking he had somehow hurt me, but as the night wore on, and he did not return to his home or ours, our parents began to get worried. I cried that whole night. They never got a word out of me. In the early morning, I finally calmed down enough to speak. I was still shocked, and I knew I could never tell them the whole story, so I told them simply that we had been exploring the maze at night, when someone, I wasn't sure who, started chasing us. I said I had lost track of him in the maze, and was too afraid to go out and look for him. That is a story that I forced myself to believe for so long. I cannot believe that I let myself be that ignorant. But perhaps the old saying, ignorance is bliss, is true, after all. My parents, of course, believed me. Armed with maps of the maze, they later went out to look for my missing best friend, but to no avail. I already knew they wouldn't find him, or my secret place. The way to get there wasn't on the map anyway. They spent days searching, but they never found him, or, as I had predicted, my secret place. Eventually they should have found it. Now I think I know why. It must have closed after the episode. They never found my best friend, and I never, ever went into my maze again. When we moved away to the States 3 years later, I left that night behind me, forced it from my mind, but I always knew I needed closure. When my parents died, they left me the old estate as part of the will. They had kept it just so that nobody else could buy it. My parents were selfish like that, but little did they know, they were probably saving some poor soul from the same fate that Tom suffered. After my husband's disappearance, I suddenly had the urge to search out my past. As I have explained, I felt the best way to do this was to find what happened to Tom, under the mask of daylight, of course. So I made a trip overseas, to the crumbling estate. Walking through those halls, with their creaking floorboards, and flowering vines that peeked through the cracks in the walls, I felt a sense of wistfulness, accompanied with the flush of memories, including that horrible night. I explored the house, or rather, the parts of it that I still could, as most of it was too dilapidated for me to set foot in, marveling at the way the house had changed over the many years of uncare. There was graffiti everywhere now, evidence of squatters, but I didn't care much. I just hoped they'd stay out of the maze. Speaking of the maze, I was surprised to see how overgrown it had become. I could tell that it would be almost impossible to navigate, but I did so anyway, hoping I could remember the way through, even after years of disuse. I brought wild lilies and poppies in with me, not sure why, but feeling oddly calm, as if this was the right thing to do. It was quite hard to work through the maze, although I was surprised to realize that I still remembered the way. Muscle memory, the thing that had saved me that dreadful night. I should have been afraid, but I had never been hurt that day, and I wasn't sure why it would be different now. Eventually, I made my way to the middle where the weeping woman sat on her knees. I now understood why they might not have found the statue. The way into the middle was completely closed off, a single wall standing there that seemed as if it belonged. But I found it easy to push through, and soon found myself faced with a terrible sight. It wasn't terrible as in scary, but just sad. The woman sat where she always had, sobbing, facing the ground, her stone mouth open in a wail of anguish. But across from her, sitting under the tree, was a familiar form with a playful look on its face, a cocky, mischievous grin, even though it was quite sad now. A look I would do anything for. It didn't look quite as old as the woman, with far less cracks and moss decorating the surface, but it looked like it had always belonged there, would always belong there. I knelt down at Tom's feet and left him the wild lilies, apologizing to him. Even if he was just a stone now, I wondered, for a split second, if he would wake like the woman when night fell, but I quickly pushed the thought away. I did not want to see him like that, like she had been, ever. I could not risk it. So, I placed the flowers in front of them and hurried away from the maze and the two statues decorating it. I stayed until that night, standing right outside of the maze, listening. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I had to just stay for a moment longer. I was glad I did. When the stars rose, instead of the horrible, grating sobbing that had imprinted itself in my mind, there came a soft whistling. I recognized it, of course. Tom and I used to whistle the tune back and forth to each other whenever we were feeling down. I wondered if he was keeping the woman company. Right before I would have come in, the whistling stopped, and I felt compelled to continue, just for a second, just for a last goodbye. So I whistled a few bars of the tune until the other whistle started up again. It was so achingly familiar. It made my heart hurt in all the right places. It felt nice though. I suppose I was finally getting my closure. I can only hope that he forgives me. Maybe he was never mad at me. Maybe he blamed himself. If so, I forgive him as well. I've been awake now for almost 60 hours, and I know I'm not going to last much longer. I'm so scared to sleep, or move accurately. I'm terrified of waking up once I go to sleep. I have insomnia, and occasionally, I also experience this weird phenomena called hypnopompic hallucinations. When I'm starting to wake up, like in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, I will see things that aren't really there. Mostly I see spiders crawling on the walls. The first couple of times, it seemed so real that I jumped out of bed and began hitting at the walls with a shoe. When I couldn't find the spiders, I would search for them, making sure they weren't in the bed or on the floor. It was terrifying. After a while, of course, I accepted the fact that they weren't real. It was just my brain tricking me as I awoke from a deep slumber. It still seemed as real as ever, and I still sometimes reacted by jumping to my feet in horror. But I also began to calm down quite a bit faster, until I developed sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a phenomena during which you believe yourself to be fully awake. Something is happening that scares you, and you find that you can't move your body. You are completely out of control. Combine the sleep paralysis with the hypnopompic hallucinations, and you get next level fear. I now see spiders crawling towards me, swinging above my head on strands of web, and I can't move. My husband has gotten used to calming me once I fully awaken and can move again. It usually involves waking him up, blubbering, tears, and up to an hour of cuddling and whispered assurances before we are both able to get back to sleep. Recently though, things have gotten so much worse. I'll start with what happened about a week ago. My husband was out of town for work, and I fell asleep in the living room. My cat, Cheshire, was snoozing next to me on my pillow, and my dog, Sirius, was laying on the floor next to the sofa. I woke-ish, and immediately saw what appeared to be a large wasp buzzing around my head. I couldn't move any part of my body, or even shout, and the worst part was, I couldn't even close my eyes. As the buzzing sound began, I realized the wasp had been quiet before, and I realized I was most likely hallucinating. The realization must have snapped my brain fully awake, and the wasp disappeared before my eyes. The buzzing, however, continued. Believing myself to be fully awake now, and finding my body responding to commands for movement, I began to sit up and blinked the sleep from my eyes. Halfway to a sitting position, I froze again. There was a figure standing at the foot of the couch. It was nearly pitch black except for the glow from a small nightlight on the other side of the room, so I couldn't make out any features. But I knew that Caleb was out of town. The figure wasn't moving a muscle, and other than the unidentified buzzing sound, I heard nothing. No breathing, no rustling as if from a slight shift of movement. He was as still as a statue. I decided I wasn't fully awake yet, and I needed to be proactive before these hallucinations got completely out of hand. So I spoke to it. Hello? My voice wasn't as strong and sure as if hoped, but I was proud of myself for facing my fears head on. The figure raised his head, and I knew that it was meeting my eyes. The buzzing sound cut off abruptly. My heart raced, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I blinked, and the figure's face was an inch from mine. Cheshire shrieked and ran off. I had no breath to scream. My eyes were locked in its dark gaze. Coal black eyes filled my vision, and I felt as if there were no good left in the world. A thick blanket of depression smothered my fear and left me wanting to die. I smelled his stale breath and felt his chest rise with it against my own. His knees were on the floor next to the couch, about where my dog had been, and I wondered in the back of my brain why he wasn't howling. He never blinked. It must have only lasted 10 or 15 seconds, but it was also a lifetime. I never blinked either. The paralysis was back with a vengeance. He spoke 3 words in a deep, gravelly voice. Time is short. I blinked, then, involuntarily, and he was gone. My dog was dead. He lay right where the dark visitor, as I started to think of him, had been. I cried inconsolably for hours before taking him to be cremated. I have been visited at each waking since that night by the same figure. It doesn't matter if it's night or morning. He speaks the same words of warning each time. They are a threat. I haven't told my husband, as there's nothing he can do from out of town anyway. He won't believe it's real, and will only suggest I go see a doctor. Currently, I'm at a hotel. I know it won't stop my visitor from appearing, but it's worth a try, and at least my cat will be safe. I want to ask it questions. What does it mean that time is short? Is it talking about my time? The time of someone I love? Is it a warning I can react to? If so, why does it feel so utterly threatening? However, so far, I have been paralyzed each time. At this point, I keep nearly dozing off while I write this, but I wanted an account out there in case one of these times it kills me. If I'm still alive after the next morning, I'll report back what has happened. For now, good night or morning, whatever. I'm so tired I don't even know anymore. Cross your fingers for me, please. When I moved into our new house as a kid, there was a big swimming pool in our backyard. The primary selling point that my parents had for moving there, or at least convincing me to be as complacent as possible, while my dad was getting accustomed to his new job. We were moving pretty far from our old house. I'd no longer go to the same school as my friends, and that was pretty upsetting at the time. Despite that, the pool seemed pretty nice, and I was excited to use it. I was even talking to my parents about inviting my old friends over to our new house, so we could all play in it together. trying to keep the dream of my friends and I never leaving each other alive. My last day of school was a Friday. I'd exchanged goodbyes with my best friends and even some games for my Game Boy. The teachers told me how much they'd miss me and gave me hugs when my mom came to pick me up from school early that day. Despite the sadness of it, it was a relatively good day. My mom also took me to my favorite burger joint that was now even closer to our new house, so I might have been able to eat there more often. Another primary selling point from my parents to me: my stuff was already packed and ready to go, and the majority of it either in the car, already, or in the moving trucks that would make their way to our new house in a few hours. We'd gone back home really quick to say our last goodbyes, and to pick up my dad from the house, where he was packing the last of his things and making sure everything was ready to go when we all left. And after that, the road trip began. Our new house was in the next town over, and it took a few hours to get there. I was already bored. And by the time we'd gotten there, my Game Boy had died, and I'd finished one of the books I'd been reading that I accidentally stole from the school library. But they had several copies of that book already, so it was fine, I think. That's why I'd been dying to go into the pool that day, because I was bored and had nothing to do, and had hyped up the idea of being able to swim in my own backyard. So you could probably tell I was pretty excited. I'd been begging my parents to let me swim in the pool for a while by that point, so they finally caved in. And as soon as I was out of that stuffy car, I whipped out my backpack and pulled out my swimsuit, just a one-piece bodysuit kind, and I ran to one of the bathrooms as fast as I could. I ran out in my swimsuit and ran out the doors as fast as my tiny 8-year-old legs could carry me. I ran to the side of the pool, surrounded by beige concrete and lined with some tan bricks, and almost fell in. Jumping into pools had always scared me, because going to the bottom of a pool was a little terrifying. What if you couldn't get back up, especially in the deeper parts of a pool, or a lake, or, God forbid, the ocean? If you made it to the bottom of the ocean, there'd be no telling if you'd ever be able to get back up. There's so many things that could happen to you. Now, I wasn't exactly scared of pools, or lakes, or the ocean, especially now with other people around me, or when I was already in the pool having fun. I just had some anxiety about it sometimes. I'd just have to hype myself up again for a bit before getting in. But today, I just decided to bite the bullet and get rid of my fear. If I were going to have to live in a house with a pool in the back of it, I would have to get over this stupid fear of pools, and the only way I could think of to do that was to just grin and bear it by jumping into it. So I did. I grabbed my nose, I closed my eyes, and scrunched my face as I jumped as high as I could in the hopes of delaying the inevitable impact of the pool. I hit the water, and then I sank, and I kept sinking. I thought I jumped into the deeper end of the pool, but I wasn't sure. I tried not to think about it as I fell deeper and deeper. I kept waiting for the bottom to hit my butt, but it never did. After a while of sinking, I opened my eyes. Everything was blurry, and my eyes felt a weird combination of dry and wet at the same time. They stung from the chlorine hitting them. I looked down at my feet, seeing my pink swimsuit. My body felt entirely too long, and while my sinking point, I could see the bottom of the pool. I didn't seem to be hitting it. I could tell I was getting closer to it, but it seemed like I would never hit it. At this point, my chest was hurting a little from the lack of air. I hadn't anticipated the pool being this deep. It was absolutely terrifying. It only made my fear of pools and large bodies of water even worse. I tried to see if I could swim down and touch the bottom of the pool, paddling my feet behind me as I turned around, going head first for the floor. But I didn't seem to be able to make it before my lungs were giving out. I coughed underwater, trying to breathe but not quite making it. I realized that I was about to drown. Immediately, I swam as fast as I could to the surface of the water, trying to get to a wall I could grab onto so I could get out and get some rest. Maybe try to take some time to think about what the actual fuck just happened. I reached the surface, coughing and wheezing as I tried to make it to the edge. I blinked the chlorine out of my eyes, and I swam for one of the walls. I managed to climb out of the pool, and I sat on the edge, panting, coughing, wheezing. My mom watched me, asking what had happened. But I felt like if I told her, she would tell me not to swim anymore, So I didn't say anything other than I had just swallowed some water. She seemed to take me for my word and patted me on the back. She asked if I wanted to get out of the pool, but I shook my head. I was just taking a break. She went back with my dad to unpack some of the stuff we had in our car, but kept an eye on me. I pondered what on earth happened there, but assumed I just misjudged the depth of the pool and had gone in too deep. So I decided instead of jumping in, I was going to walk in using the stairs at one of the ends instead. I walked over, grabbed a rail, and stepped into the pool. See? It had a tangible bottom I could feel with my feet. Nothing to be afraid of. Except it didn't. Immediately upon stepping off the last step of the pool, my foot fell through the bottom, and instantly, I was falling underwater. For a few split seconds, I couldn't breathe. I was choking on water. Water got in my nose, and I was coughing, trying to find oxygen where there wasn't any. I almost threw up. After a couple more seconds of pure agony, I made it to the surface again. I don't know how. I don't know why. At first, I thought I had managed to flail myself into getting to the surface of the pool again, or that someone had managed to pull me out, but I'll never know. Either way, I could breathe again. When I made it to the surface, I didn't pay attention to anything other than the fact that I could breathe again. I spent several minutes coughing and wheezing, blowing water out of my nose, and throwing up all the water I'd sucked into my stomach and lungs, while near drowning. When I got my bearings and stood up again, I decided that I wasn't going to swim anymore. I'd had my fill for the day, and would try again some other time, but when I looked up, something felt off. Everything looked relatively the same. At least I thought it did at first, but a closer look made me realize that something was off. The green grass in my backyard was just a little too dull, like it was dead or dying, when it had been a lively green just before. The pool water had more leaves in it than I remember it having, and the shade of blue was just a little more green. I looked to my house, and the paint on the wood looked a little less fresh, more like it was chipping off. The wood the porch was made out of had holes in it, and the whole place had a sickly sweet smell of old candy and rotting something. My mother came out of the house to talk to me again, and she was especially off. Her eyes were a bit too wide, her smile too fake, and full of too many teeth. Her arms were a bit longer than they should have been. Her ponytail was messier, and her hair looked more frail, like it would snap right off if you tried to brush it. Her skin looked a little leathery, and paler than it did before. I didn't like it. I didn't like her. Whatever that was, it was not my mother. I don't know if she could sense my unease, or was asking based on the fact that I looked like hell rolled over, but she asked me what was wrong. I shook my head and tried to hide my discomfort. I told her nothing was wrong, that I had just stayed underwater for too long, which is what I had thought was happening at the time. I was wrong. She asked again if I was going to take another break or stop entirely, and I said yes. I thought that a little time away from the pool would do me some good, even if my own mother terrified the hell out of me, due to the fact that she was a creepy son of a bitch at the time. My mom brought me a towel and helped me dry off, even though the feel of her skin on mine made me want to vomit. It felt awful, and I didn't want her touching me ever again. She told me that my stuff was in my room, and I could change there. Also, Dad was cooking dinner. That was weird because my dad never cooked. It was always my mom. I thought it was weird, but I guess it could have just been my new house with a new life. After all, he could be a pretty good cook or something, right? My mom showed me to my room and left me alone to change. My bedroom was a sickly shade of pink with a mattress on the floor. My bed frame hadn't arrived yet, so I'd have to sleep on the floor. At least someone put a sheet and a blanket and a pillow on it for the time being. There were flies flying around the room, and it didn't seem like the ceiling lights worked at all, no matter how many times I flipped the light switch. Despite how all of this unnerved me, I pried my swimsuit off and put on some capri shorts and a light blue tank top and a gray hoodie to keep me warm. I went downstairs and walked to the kitchen, where my father was making dinner. I was hoping that my mom's appearance would change, but instead, it only seemed to get worse as time went on. She was in the kitchen with my dad, who I hadn't quite seen yet. When she walked out and her smile was wider, her teeth seemed sharper, her nails seemed longer, yellower, her skin grayer and more unhealthy. Her eyes were bloodshot. She was so uncomfortable to look at. I blamed it all on getting chlorine in my eyes at the time, wishing desperately that I would have put goggles on. My mother always warned me to, but I didn't this time. I felt stupid and terrified, and I didn't know how to bring it up. Now, I'm glad I didn't. My mother told me she was just about to ask to help set up the table for dinner. It was almost ready. We were going to have pasta. I went to the kitchen to grab what few plates we'd brought in the car with us, and that's when I saw my dad. Just like Mom, the differences were subtle at first. He was a little taller. His long, thin nose was a little longer and a little thinner. The bags under his eyes seemed a little darker. His body was a little fatter, with his shirt not covering his stomach as well as it should have. When he spoke to me, his voice was a little deeper and grainier. He sounded more tired. He asked me how I was doing and if I wanted pasta for dinner, but didn't give me time to answer because he told me it was too late. We're having it anyways. He laughed to himself like he told some kind of joke, but I didn't get it, if there was supposed to be one. I just told him I was going to set the table with Mom and grab some of the plates from the cabinet behind him. I held the stack of 3 plates in my arms and set them down on the counter to grab silverware, putting the former on top of the latter and going to the dining table to set them out for everyone. It was then that I noticed the plates had skulls on them, and the handles on the forks and spoons had skulls on them too. Coming out of the skull's eyes were some kind of weird tentacles or something. That was a little unnerving, but I set the table like nothing was wrong. I put the plates and silverware down in the place we usually had them. Mom and Dad next to each other, and then me across from them. I sat them on the designated spot at the table and waited for dinner like usual. It wouldn't be very long now, but time felt skewed. It felt like I was waiting for hours, but by the time dinner got to my plate, it only felt like seconds. I felt like I wasn't right in the head, like I wasn't all there for some reason. Things started looking like they were underwater, but I couldn't tell why, and I couldn't seem to ground myself. Mom told me I looked ill, like I was going to throw up. I felt like it too. The feeling got worse when dinner was served. From my perspective, the pasta didn't look like pasta. It looked like it was moving. It made me feel sick. Sicker. I looked at my supposed parents, and they seemed to be eating their dinner just fine. But I poked at it, and I thought it had made a sound, like it was alive or something. I got a closer look, and the entire thing looked like worms. Worms covered in pasta sauce. My parents looked at me worriedly, while I looked at my plate of dinner with disgust. I told my parents that I wasn't hungry. I was feeling ill, and I was going to lay down, and ran upstairs as fast as I could. I was hoping that if I went to bed, I could wake up from this awful nightmare, but I never did. I just stayed in my room the entire night, barely managing to fall asleep, terrified out of my mind. When I woke up the next day, I was still in the same house, smelling like rotting desserts. It made me feel sick inside, and I wondered how I'd even managed to fall asleep last night, considering the smell. I didn't want to leave my room, even though I probably had to. I left my bedroom and went downstairs to find both of my parents awake. My father was in the kitchen, cooking another delicious meal, and my mother at the breakfast table, eating a piece of toast and reading a book, with a mug of questionable black liquid sitting next to her. It seemed piping hot, and it smelled like hot garbage. Well, that was either the weird cup of joe my mom had, or the breakfast that my father was cooking in the kitchen. Either way, I could hardly stand it. I went outside to get a breath of fresh air, and found that my mother had hung up a clothesline. Among one of the things on it was my swimsuit from yesterday. That was weird because I don't remember her doing any laundry, or us even having a washing machine or a dryer in the house. I shrugged it off, but then I saw my swimsuit on the clothesline. The swimsuit reminded me that I had gotten into this mess by swimming into it, so maybe I could swim out of it. I grabbed my swimsuit off of the clothesline and ran back inside to change. My mother immediately stopped in front of me. She asked me what I was doing, and her appearance was even worse than it was yesterday. Her mouth was sharp, coming to a point in the middle of her face like a bird's beak. Her eyes were wide, and her hair was brittle, falling apart on her head. Pieces of it fell onto her shoulders, and on the floor as she spoke. but it didn't look like she was moving a muscle as she did. Not even her mouth moved. Her nose was flat, and her teeth were so very, very sharp, in a weird shade of grayish, with pieces of green food stuck in between them. Her skin was wrinkled in a sickly shade of yellowish gray, like she was severely jaundiced. Her tone was sharp and quiet, accusatory, almost like she knew what I was doing. I nervously told her that I was just going to go swimming, like yesterday. She grabbed my swimsuit out of my hand and told me that I wasn't going to play in a dirty swimsuit, and because I didn't have any more, that I wouldn't be going at all. She seemed to sense my unease, my desperate need to get into the pool and escape, and she grabbed me by the shoulder, sitting me at the dining table forcefully. I could feel her hands bruising my shoulder while she grabbed it, with her fingernails digging into my skin, just enough to hurt, but not enough to make me bleed. She told me to sit while we both waited for my dad to serve breakfast. I told her I wasn't hungry, that I just wanted to go swimming for a bit before I ate, and eventually she got fed up enough that she took my swimsuit in her unnerving hands and pulled it apart in front of me, tearing it up. No, she said. I wasn't going to swim at all for my whining. Immediately, I caught up from my chair, panicking and just trying to escape from this hell, and I ran outside as fast as I could. My mother screamed at me, trying to get at me, calling for my father as I ran. I looked behind me while I was getting away to see my mother's arms getting disturbingly long and horrific, at least a couple of feet, and they were moving in my direction. She was trying to catch me. When I was in the yard, it almost seemed like it was getting longer and longer as I tried to get closer to the pool. I was running out of breath, out of stamina, and I didn't think I was going to make it to the pool. Behind me, my mother and father were getting closer. My mother's arms suddenly got longer and longer, reaching out to try and catch me, and at that point, fear was the only thing keeping me going. My father lunged after me, jumping on the ground, and his fat body caused it to shake every time, tripping me up a couple of times. I screamed in vain as I tried to run away from the two of them, tears pouring down my face as I felt my mother's disgusting hands touch my long hair, grabbing and pulling, desperately trying to yank me back with her. I finally made it to the edge of the pool, and then, even as I stood, hesitating, my mother and father were gaining on me even more, and my mother even swiped at my ankles from several feet away, and that was the only incentive I had to jump in. I didn't even hold my breath. I swam to the bottom of the pool as fast as I could, my lungs burning for air, and before long I was choking on water, getting it up my nose as I tried to inhale instinctively, but it never worked. My body didn't find what it was looking for, and instead, I only found my vision fading in and out. The only thing that told me that I was safe was the fact that I felt my hand hit air just before I had passed out. When I woke up, I found myself with my mother on the ground, soaking wet. I was disoriented, tired, coughing up all kinds of liquids I didn't even want to think about at the time. My mother saw this and was crying tears of joy on her normal face to see that her daughter had survived. I couldn't even tell what she was saying, but I was seeing police lights, or some kind of other emergency lights, flashing all around me. Some guy took me from my mother, and I was confused and a little scared, but he gave me an oxygen mask, which helped me breathe a bit better, but it kind of made my mouth dry up. My body felt weak, and my head was so light that I'd passed out again. I woke up in the hospital a day later. As it turned out, I was missing that night, at least in my real home. I was with those demonic things, whatever they were, in that other world. I didn't even know I was gone for so long, but I was missing for the rest of that night and that morning, until I showed up in the pool again, in different clothes. I told everyone that I'd had no idea what happened, with no memory of any events, but I don't think they entirely believed me. For the next several years, I'd had so many kitty shrinks try and coax it out of me, but I knew they'd never believe me, so I never said anything. We moved again after that night. I haven't gone into a swimming pool since. To this day, I've never looked at my parents the same. I wasn't there for long, but sometimes I think I am there. I have nightmares about it all the time. I guess I'd been left with some kind of PTSD from that entire event. I wouldn't be surprised, but it's not like anyone would ever believe me on it, so it's not like I'd be able to talk to anyone about it to get it diagnosed. Even the internet probably thinks I'm crazy. Sometimes I look in the mirror, and I still see the face of that monster that looked like my mother. I'd always been told that I looked like my mother, but since that day, I'd never taken it as a compliment again. Sometimes I look into the bottoms of pools and wonder if it would ever happen again. If I'd be willing to take that chance, but I never do. In my nightmares, my parents always tell me that they're coming for me, that they're looking for me. I try to tell myself that they're just nightmares, but sometimes I see things in the corner of my eyes that I feel like prove me otherwise. Things in the bottom of pools, lakes, oceans, and other large bodies of water, sometimes even smaller ones, like the bath or a sink that's filled up. I avoid them like the plague now. I hate them. I don't want to be reminded of that day. I'll do anything to forget about it. But part of me can't help but wonder,